Hello, Internet, and welcome to episode number 251 of the Comic Watchers Show. He's Chad, I'm Matt. We watch comics, and this is our show. Thank you so much for listening this week. Chad, how have you been?
As well as I guess anybody can be these days.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. So this week we have got returning guest, Mr. Mark Russell. How are you, Mark?
Doing good.
Good to hear from you. Good to see you. Glad you're with us this week. We are talking about your new prose novel, Grimm and Grimmer. Chad's got it right there. It is a update and remixing of classic Grimm's fairy tales. So this is exciting stuff. This is your first prose book in what, 10 years?
That's exactly right.
Man. So what made you decide A, to return to prose, and B, decide to return in this fashion?
Well, I was approached by Running Press. They wanted to do a book about the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, and they'd read the book I'd written about the Bible called God is Disappointed in You. So they approached me to ask me if I'd be interested. And I wasn't sure at first. I wasn't sure if I'd be interested or not. So I actually just got a copy of, it wasn't all the Brothers Grimm fairy tales because there's hundreds of them, but it was a lot of them. I got a book with a lot of the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. And I just started reading them. And this is kind of when I'm not sure if I should take a project or not. This is what I do. I just start thinking about it and reading the source material and then seeing if it gives me any ideas. And this was almost instantaneous. Like I just started getting all these ideas, things to say about it, and like started picking out which ones I wanted to write. Mm-hmm. And I said yes the next day because I felt like once I started thinking about these things, I just couldn't stop because they're so primordial. Not just like the other thing I found really sort of refreshing about them is that they're not morality tales. They're not like parables. They're stories that are often have very bizarre and not very rewarding endings. It's almost like they are like stories you would tell to your shrink, like tell me what's wrong with me, Doc. But it's like the human race going to its shrink and saying, here's the sorts of things I'm afraid of, or the sorts of stories I find amusing. Tell me what's wrong with me, Doc.
Chad?
So as you were going through, because in the book there's, some of the well-known ones like Hansel and Gretel, Snow White, Cinderella, and then there was, some that, I really haven't heard of. How did you go through that process of picking out the ones that you wanted to put your spin on?
Well, I think I've deliberately wanted to be a mix of both of those. I wanted it to be the hits and also ones that are really obscure that nobody had ever heard of, which in many cases are the better stories. But I want it for that reason, because I wanted to give people something to latch onto. Everyone knows the story of Cinderella, so they can see how the original Brothers Grimm version is very different than the Disney version or the version they probably read in children's books before. So I wanted to give them a point of reference to say, oh, this is what a Brothers Grimm fairy tale is like. It's not at all like what I thought it was. And then also to point them to some of the really more obscure ones, which are not only some of the better stories, but also just to show them like how deep down the rabbit hole you can go with these things. And there's some really fascinating ones in there too. Some ones I just sort of stumbled upon. And the other thing that's really kind of interesting is that they're all very different lengths. There were some fairy tales that just went on for 10, 20 pages, and some that were like half a page long. And I found that almost like the Bible, where it's just like there's sometimes you come to the book of Psalms, and then sometimes it's like the book of Habakkuk. And I like that sort of variation of length too.
So
when I was,
go ahead. No, please.
I was just going to say when I was, this is the first book I actually, because I'm a big audiobook person, so I actually had to read this one.
There is an audiobook. Version. I'm not sure if it's out yet, but we did get someone to, like an actor, to read it.
That's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to everybody reading it in whatever fashion they can, either the audiobook or the hardcover.
So do you have a different work process with prose than you would say a comic?
Well, yeah, and especially if it's prose like this that's based upon actual source material, not just me making up a bunch of stuff. It's much more research intensive. I think it's much more prone to rewriting and me trying to say what I'm saying, what I want to say, even quicker. Like, can I cut? I think with something like this, the way it starts is like I empty out the silverware drawer and just write for pages and pages, and then I go back and just start throwing stuff out like this
Right.
more succinctly. I think that's the way I like when I'm writing nonfiction, especially research based nonfiction like this. That's the way I like to make it as short and brief as possible, just so because I think that's where that's when you really start to understand the essence of what it is you're talking about. When you can make it quick.
So when you are writing and you're retelling the tale, and how do you go about putting like your little spin on the dialogue or the without it being too, I guess, heady? Maybe is the word I
Yeah.
want to say.
Well, the hard part I think sometimes is getting the tone right, because I feel like sometimes I have so much fun writing little jokes and doing sort of wacky things. I wonder sometimes if I'm going too far in that direction, if it's maybe becoming too just sort of funny for its own good, or if it's just feels like I'm not really capturing the essence of the story because I'm leaning into it for laughs. And so that's kind of what I think about now. It's like, should I pull back here? Because what I want, my goal is for beyond laughs or whatever, is this to be just a fundamentally good story. Like, people are reading this wanting to know what's going to happen next. And also beyond that, like why someone told the story. Like, what is it? What is the eternal human truth that drove someone to come up with the story in the first place? And then if you can make it funny or scary along the way, that's great. But I really wanted to like cut things that I thought weren't adding to those first two, where it's like, this is a good story, and it's a story that says something about the mind of the person who wrote it, or the people in this case, because these
Sure. Yeah.
stories are through a myriad of different retellings and versions. It's almost like like um, a composite of the human psyche, because so many people touch these stories. It's like an old blues song, so many different versions there, but they all sort of talk about the same thing
Mhm.
that was really relevant to everyone who not only told the story but who changed it.
Do you feel intimidated in any way, like tapping into that historic narrative?
Not really, because I don't really view it as holy scripture, or like the Dead Sea Scrolls or something. Especially with something like Brothers Grimm fairy tales, where these have been revised, dozens of times. There's a lot of different versions of these stories out there. There's different versions within the Brothers Grimm, like they retold the same stories several times, oftentimes just little mutations. So I feel like I'm just part of that tradition. I don't. The pressure's off, because I know that these stories are themselves the product of a lot of little tweaks and changes and different voices coming in. So I don't feel too bad about being just one of those voices.
One of the things wanted to do is kind of go back and listen to, find the original ones and kind of compare, but I didn't have enough time. But I definitely plan on doing that. So how much, when you were researching, were there stories that, you know, kind of said, oh, I want to do this one, but I don't think it'll, I don't know, fly or be received as well as, you know,
Yeah, there were some of those. In fact, one of the stories I spent the most time working on was a story that involved the Virgin Mary, which is also sort of an unusual thing about the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, which I wasn't aware of just as a casual fan, was that religious figures, Christian like saints and like God Himself, show up in these stories sometimes. And there was a story about the Virgin Mary trying to teach this young girl a lesson about telling the truth, and the girl wouldn't just not stop lying to the Virgin Mary, and to the point where the Virgin Mary had her like banished to the earth, and she was like living inside of a tree, and she was just looking outside a knothole in the tree that had grown up around her, and she was condemned to stay there until she told the truth, and the tree would just grow when she lied. But it was a fascinating story, and there's so much great imagery. The reason why I didn't make it in was because it didn't really have an ending. It didn't really have a landing point. Although I think it would have been fantastic to give Alicia the chance to draw this girl trapped inside a tree.
I think one of my favorite ones, which one I never heard, is the Tailor and his Underachieving Sons. And I like the last line and the moral of the story. I'm just sitting there reading. I think it was at my son's swim class, and I sat there and started chuckling.
Yeah, that's not too atypical for a Brothers Grimm quote unquote moral either. Usually the conclusion of the story or the takeaway is just like, well, sometimes you just got to beat a fool, sometimes.
The moral of the story is violence.
Yeah, or it's like the right person is the one who brought two swords.
So
now, this isn't. Oh, go ahead.
No, you're fine, Chad.
Okay. So again, it's not the typical, comic book, but there is some really cool art. Tell us a little bit about the artist and how you worked with her.
I'm gonna butcher her last name. She's Czech, but it's written there.
That's why I was going to have. That's why I was going to have you say it.
But Alicia, they gave us like several artists to choose from for the book, and both my editor and I thought she was the best and I think the reason for that was just because of the utter expressiveness in the faces. The artwork, the sample art that she submitted just was like haunting, just because I felt like I could tell somebody's entire life story just by looking at their face. And there's like children with genuine terror on their face, and I thought this is like almost like a Brothers Grimm fairy tale in a single image. And so we really wanted her to do it, and I'm really happy with not only how well they turned out, but just like also just sort of blown away by the amount of time and work and effort she put into each and every one of these drawings. Each one of them just looks like an incredible, like she spent a year on this.
And some of them are really creepy.
Yeah, and they're very, very dark and suggestive. So totally good fit for the book. I think I'm obviously trying to sell the book, so I'm a little biased, but even if you're out there hate watching me, it would be worth getting just for Alicia's artwork alone.
Did you find any sort of special challenge in maintaining your voice as a writer with these?
The main thing for the voice was I just wanted to be consistent. I didn't want some to be, really goofy and then others I wanted to like have a consistent voice throughout it. So I think it was the trouble was just sort of like reining it in sometimes, like not trying to force it with the voice and just letting the stories be the star and make it like me telling these stories, what I thought was important about them, rather than using these stories as a vehicle to do my song and dance.
How long did it take you to work on this project?
It took about 3 months.
Okay.
Which is about as quick as I've ever written a book like this, but I think part of it was that it was just so engrossing and I was so obsessed with it that every day I was just like writing more and more, and then mostly rewriting, and a lot of it was, a lot of reading too. But yeah, it was one of the projects one of the books I've worked on that just seemed to flow the quickest, just because I felt like there was just no shortage of things to say about it, no shortage of like inspiration.
Now, as you're writing this, I'm going to assume you're also writing your other comics, other projects that you work on. Was it easy transitioning from that over to this, or from this over to that, or was there kind of a mental state that you had to, mental gymnastics you had to do?
Not everyone's like this as a writer, but for me personally, I like going back and forth between different projects, because it's sort of like when you go down the rabbit hole with one, you get sort of burned out, you hit dead ends, you get, sort of writer's block. It's like, or you just get tired of it. But then to move on to something else, it's like that part of your brain that's working on this project gets to sort of heal. The soil gets, its nutrients replenished while you're working on something that's completely different. And then when you come back to it the next day or a week later or whatever, it feels like, you're ready to write again. So I like having multiple projects going at the same time. I think it helps with all of them.
It probably explains why you've been so prolific throughout your career.
I frankly just wouldn't know what to do with myself if I didn't have more than one project going on. I used to have a day job, so that was like back when I only wrote one title at a time, is because I had a day job. But now that I do this full time, it's like I feel like one title or one thing at a time or one a month would just be, I would feel kind of bonkers if it was all I was working on.
Was there a particular story that you included that was maybe a favorite of yours, or one that?
Yeah, there was a couple actually. I just thought were like, I hope people read the book this far. The one of the ones I really loved was The Child of Good Fortune, which comes in close to the end, about a king who makes it his like sort of life's work to like destroy this child, because there was a prophecy that this child would grow up to marry the daughter of the king and become king himself someday. It's the story not only of the kid's sort of luck in escaping all the king's sort of foiling the king's plans, but just the sort of weird adventures that this sends him on. And it's one of my favorite of all the Brother Grimm fairy tales. And he ends up like meeting the devil's grandma. And I don't think I've ever encountered a story. I don't think I've ever encountered in fiction or otherwise the devil's grandmother.
Do you happen to know the origin or genesis of the devil's grandmother beyond Grimm's fairy tales?
No, I don't know that she exists in any sort of theological fashion beyond the Grimm's fairy tale, but she seemed like a nice lady. She seemed a lot easier to deal with than Satan himself.
Well, there you
I
go.
think that to me it said that like, well, Satan was probably raised correctly. He's just a bad apple. He just went off the rails at some point.
So beyond this book, you've got X Factor going on right now, and do you have any other projects that are forthcoming that you can talk about yet?
Yeah, I've got some things I'm really excited about. Some of which aren't technically announced yet, but
Are you allowed to talk about the one with fellow Portlandian creator Ryan?
I'll talk about it whether I'm allowed to or not, but it is one of the ones that is hitherto not announced. But one of the ones I'm most excited for is I've always wanted to do a sci-fi anthology series like the Twilight Zone, which, usually when you talk to a publisher and you say, oh, I wanted to do an anthology series and it's going to be science fiction, they are like hanging up on you before you finish, because it just screams sales death. Like no recurring characters, not superhero, no capes. It's like your series has very little to recommend it, sir. But Man Cave was actually very enthusiastic about the idea, and I wanted to feel kind of like indie and like have artists people weren't familiar with. So there's a guy here in town named Ryan Alexander Tanner who he drew and wrote this book about Muhammad Ali, which I just loved. I just was blown away by it. So we were talking and it's like, well, we should do like a sci-fi anthology series together. And I told him some of my ideas and he's like, well, I'd love to draw it. So I don't have the time to draw all those issues, but if you want to work on it with me, I'll draw like half of them. So he's drawing half the issues and we're bringing another artist to draw the other half. But it's basically, if I was writing Twilight Zone, they're sort of like my existentialist Twilight Zone episodes. It's called Vanishing Point, and the one sort of common thread through all of them is at some point someone will have an axe the logo for the series is an astronaut with an axe, and the axe shows up in every single issue, and for some reason or another. But they're all kind of about how we deal with the dehumanizing effects of modernity, of like living in a post-technological civilization.
Yeah, I had talked to Ryan about when he was kickstarting the Muhammad Ali book and mentioned it. So
yeah, I'm really excited for that. And then I'm also doing Racer X, the spinoff of the Speed Racer title that also done by Mad Cave. And David Pepose is writing the Speed Racer title, and I'm doing the Racer X limited series, which is really, I love the fact that they let me do a limited series, and two, that it gets to be Racer X, because it's much, I think, darker. It's more noirish. It's a nice sort of counterpart to Speed Racer, which, you know, is very bubbly and colorful and, you know, wacky. And then like Racer X is sort of dark and brooding, and, you know, it's got this internal monologue, and they exist in the same universe. Like with the races and stuff, the events that you're reading in David's series are also referred to in mine, but you see him through Racer X's perspective, and it's like he's living in a different world just because he's the product of betrayal.
Interesting. And I'm sure we're going to get, at some point, we're going to get more Billionaire Island, and
I would hope, but I don't know. It seems like that's done, but it seems like if that series ever had a moment, this would be it. I don't know why.
So
I don't know why, you know, it's not in like back in you know, high production, why they're not trying to push it. I know that there is a creative team trying to make a movie based on it. So hopefully something comes of that. But, you know, it's like the problem is that it's like, oh, it's a movie about how billionaires are destroying the planet, and we are reliant upon billionaires to fund this movie.
and then you just have to turn on the news.
right.
Yeah, the first Billionaire Island series I wrote, the original, was about how now that they've destroyed the planet, and this takes place, I think, 30 years in the future, they've created like a separate island to escape the end of the world that they've caused. And the second one is about after the collapse of that island, how the rest the United States has, you know, is in effect become Billionaire Island. It's this land that's sort of like is no longer a functioning nation. It's given over to conspiracy theories, and nobody trusts each other, and militias take over the freeways. You know, go figure. Where, I don't know where this stuff comes from. But if I were to do a third one, it would be about the people who are not all in on this sort of fantasy-driven fascist nightmare, creating their own island. It would be the opposite of Billionaire Island. It would be like the island you go to escape the fact that billionaires and their willful accomplices control everything else.
Well, if that happens, then there definitely should be some Cybertruck references, because I know you're a fan of those.
Yeah, no, I love me a good Cybertruck.
Everybody loves a good dumpster fire.
Yeah, it's I would compare it to the Chevy El Camino, but that's just not really fair to the Chevy El Camino.
It's really not. It's like somebody took a Pontiac Aztec and mated it with a DeLorean.
It may be the worst designed vehicle in automotive history.
It really might. It reminds me when the many years ago when on The Simpsons, when they let Homer design a car.
Yeah,
the Canyonero.
Yeah,
no, not the Canyonero.
The Canyonero is probably a much better metaphor for the Cybertruck than
absolutely
the Chevy El Camino.
So where can folks find Grimm and Grimmer? Is it available for sale online yet?
It's available online. It should be at your Barnes and Noble, or your independent bookstore. If you're in Portland here, we're going to be selling it at Powell's City of Books in downtown Portland on March 5th. I'm going to be discussing the book and storytelling in general with none other than Brian Michael Bendis.
I saw that.
We're going to do an in-conversation thing. So if you're in town on March 5th, 7 p.m., that's a Wednesday, so you shouldn't have anything else going on. Come to Powell City of Books, and we'll hook you up.
Sounds exciting.
Are you still working with the Northwestern Cartoon Museum?
Yeah, the Northwest Museum of Comic Arts. It's a museum in sort of theory only. We don't really have a brick and mortar space, but the idea is to start with training programs. And we've done a lot of really cool stuff with like teaching kids how to do cartooning and comics and exposing people to like the technology of comic arts. And we've had a lot of really good instructors teaching courses for the museum. Ryan Alexander Tanner being one, Steve Lieber being another. And our hope is to like get enough of a escape velocity to actually like fundraise ourselves into a physical space where we would have a curated collection focusing on the cartoon and comic arts of Pacific Northwest creators, of which there are many.
That was kismet. So have you always been in the Pacific Northwest, or did you find yourself migrating there?
I have lived my entire life within 10 miles of the Willamette River. I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, which is about 2 hours south of Portland. And then I moved to Portland, and I just sort of got stuck here. I never made it, never progressed beyond Portland. I traveled a lot. I've traveled all over the world, but I don't think I've ever been in a city where I thought, yeah, this is better. I should come here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are places that I make a mental note, and it's like if they were to like kick me out of Portland, if I were to be exiled, I have a list of cities I would want to go to, maybe places I would go to, or if things get really bad in the United States, I know I think I have some ideas of where I would move. But all things being equal, I just really like the city.
You think what's in the water up there in the Pacific Northwest that creates so many great creative voices? I mean, and not just comics, but prose and music, and it's like there's this whole ecosystem there that just seems to be supportive of creative voices.
Well, I think it's a couple of things, and one is the fact that it rains a lot, so people are inside working on their novel or working on their art, and they're not going outside as much as if you live in like LA or somewhere nice. And then the other thing is that nobody really feels like they have the right to tell you no. Like it's like a good example of sort of the Portland mindset, I think, is there was a food cart, and I think, and I'm pretty sure we invented the food carts. That might be hubris on my part, but I think they started here in Portland. But there was one in particular that was selling fried chicken sandwiches with like peanut butter and jalapenos on them. And I thought, there is no way that can be good. So I had to try one. I went through it and I ordered one. And I was right. It was terrible. But the fact that you could sort of fail gently is a big draw here. It's like, okay, well, the peanut butter with fried chicken and jalapeno sandwich didn't work out great, but I'll come back next week with a gourmet grilled cheese sandwich or something, and then people love that. So I think people aren't as afraid to fail here. It's like people don't feel like failures. They're going to have the stink of failure associated with them if they try wacky things, and people are willing to try wacky things. So I think it's a different just mode of thought than like somewhere like New York or the East Coast, where it's like the pressure's on, or it's like the Bear or something, where it's like the pressure's on and you better be the best, sandwich place in the world the moment you open. It doesn't really matter so much here. So I think that's a good environment for artists and writers to gestate in.
So have you had the inkling to flex your artistic drawing abilities again?
No, I mean, I do draw a little bit just for benefit of artists, so to tell them what I'm thinking about when I'm writing things. But I think eventually I would do another book of cartoons. I just don't. It was just such a pain the last time. It was just so much work, and I didn't make very much money off of it. So, yeah, I'll probably wait before I do that again.
You've also had some Kickstarter action here recently with the Traveling to Mars hardcover. How did that work? How'd that go for you?
Well, I didn't. I had nothing to do with the Kickstarter. That was a blaze, but the book itself, I'm incredibly pleased with. Out in stores now. If they don't carry it at your local comic shop because it comes from a kind of a small publisher, please ask for it, because I'm as proud of that as I am of anything. I think, in fact, it might be the best thing I've ever written, and it's something I hope everyone has a chance to buy, or at least look at, or steal, or check out from the library. I don't care how it's done. I just would like for you to read it, because I feel like this is my tombstone book.
I think between that and One Star Squadron, you've kind of cornered the market on just absolutely destroying people's heartstrings for the right reasons.
Well, and I don't think anyone, I'm not sure how many people even read One Star Squadron, but I felt like that was, again, something I was just so proud of. And to get to work with Steve Lieber, and I felt like this is like a book I'm just really behind, and I would spend years working on this if they let me. But you just never know, and what's going to catch on with people. You just have to keep writing. But yeah, I feel like that was one where it's like, it really is, the fact that they're superheroes is kind of incidental, and it's more just about people on the downswing of their lives, and how they, the less they are able to like turn to their powers, their former fame, the more they have to sort of turn to each other. And that's what the story is about people finding out the importance of others when they're no longer as bad as they thought they were, when they're no longer on the top of their game, which, I think describes most of us.
Yeah.
So do you feel that like you had an impact with the decline of Applebee's following Death Ratioed?
I don't think I had anything to do with it. It wasn't, Applebee's was a functioning business in my timeline when I wrote it. But yeah, but at least, I maybe I'll start doing that. I'll start like approaching like extortion wise. I'll approach restaurants and say, if you don't want to be the villain, if you don't want to be causes the end of the world in 20 years, it's like, hook me up with some blooming onions.
And I know that you got to dip your toe into the Star Wars universe with the red, white, or the black, white, and Maul.
Yeah, I was very happy to do that. And again, I felt like it was sort of One Star Squadron, and they let me like take this sort of action property and write a story with some emotional heft about the characters. It's full of action too, but it's more about the internal lives of these characters who are sent to this planet, this moon, to sort of rehabilitate. They're all sort of old soldiers of fortune and bounty hunters who've been sort of psychologically destroyed by this work, by the fact that they are basically professional murderers and guns for hire. So they go to this moon to sort of rehabilitate and reintegrate into society and do something good for once by taking care of the people on this colony. And then they get attacked by Darth Maul, and they have to like sort of go back to their old tricks, their old sort of like bounty hunter, soldier for hire, like sort of training to defend this moon from Darth Maul, who just tears through them because he's a Sith Lord, and they're like kind of over the hill bounty hunters who are having to sort of like fight him off. But I was very happy with how that story turned out, and I would love to write more Star Wars. I actually have pitched a couple of Star Wars series, which I don't think there's much chance they'll get made. But one was about Jar Jar Binks, and about him like sort of like standing trial, him being like held for like having a Nuremberg trial for his role in assisting the Empire come to power. And it was going to be him sort of like, at the Haifa Institute writing his memoirs and, talking about what he did. And that was going to be used in his trial to determine whether or not he was innocent or guilty of being a patsy or being a collaborator with the Empire. Can't imagine why they didn't greenlight that one.
Well, I could also see you.
It's still out there.
I could also see you kind of doing like a tag and bink thing that they did over Dark Horse, which was one of the things good about the Dark Horse Star Wars series, was they kind of explored like the different corners and allowed a little to have some fun with it.
Yeah, I like that. I like this sort of like, well, here's a story in the universe, but it's not like a crowd pleaser. It's not like trying to like, be a top 10 seller or tell like they're not saving the galaxy in every single issue. It's just like maybe one about the Cantina Band, or, one about like the what it was like to be like the mayor in the Cloud City when the Empire, before the Empire showed up.
Yeah. Well, again, I think you would be good for. I don't know if you've read the books, but they did from a certain point of view, where they did like stories from different characters within the original trilogy and how they kind of connected. I could
That
see
sounds
you,
great.
I could see you fitting in really well in that little niche.
Yeah, I would love to write more Star Wars, but I think that from the sweet spot would be for it to be my idea that I bring to them, as opposed to them just saying, "Oh, write this High Republic story, and here's the characters." And
Yeah. I can't imagine you would thrive very well in a circumstance like that.
no,
However,
I'm better off just writing pitches that have a 99% chance of rejection. Just writing 100 of them, so that one gets through.
I was going to say you're thriving right now in the X-Men biosphere.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying that, and in part because I get to work with Bob Q, who I've worked with. I think I've worked with Bob more than I worked with any other artist in the industry, and I just love working with them. Yeah, because we did Red Sonja together. We did the Lone Ranger, other series like nobody's read. We did a couple of like Avengers one shots together, but I think we just work well. We have a good shorthand. And it's just such a rich universe. There's so many characters coming and going. There's just no shortage of sort of cool people that can show up in your comic. And then I've always found the general themes of the X-Men, of like trying to live in a world that kind of they're at once in awe of your powers, but at the same time they're afraid of you and completely suspicious of your motives. I just feel like there's so many great stories to tell within these themes with these characters. I'm grateful I got a chance to tell one of them.
And I think the X Factor being the kind of that little government type niche, that fits really well into your wheelhouse, where you can kind of tell your type stories that are layered.
Yeah, and I think a lot of my work is about human institutions, and about human institutions that don't really, that at some point stop serving humans. I think this is where civilization always goes wrong. Is like you create these institutions to serve the needs of humans living together in large numbers, but the civilization lasts long enough that the flow of service reverses, and then the people start existing to serve the institutions. And that's when you have to sort of like, that's when you need sort of reform or revolt, or you need to begin sort of questioning the power structures. And that's what this story is largely about, is like that they're expected to like die for people who don't necessarily care about whether or not they live. They are they're expected to serve X Factor without question, when X Factor doesn't seem to be serving them at all.
And I
Was
know there's that one scene with Pyro. I forget the character he's talking to, but that I know you posted it on your page, but that was you know pretty strong emotionally.
Yeah, there's Cecilia Reyes loses somebody in the course of my run on X Factor, and she's grieving, and at first he's trying to cheer her up, but then he realizes how stupid and almost infantile it is to try to cheer someone up who's grieving the death. So he gives up on trying to cheer her up, and he just sort of like tells her what he thinks happens, or what the silver lining, or why he thinks like death is important and worth grieving, as opposed to trying to cheer her up. And that was like I think probably one of my favorite moments I've got to write in X Factor, when I get a chance to have these characters just sort of talk to each other as human beings, as fellow characters, when they're not like blowing stuff up.
were there any characters that you wanted to bring into X Factor that you were told were off limits?
Yeah, it was sort of, like a NFL fantasy draft, where it's like, oh, they're taken, they're taken. So it was easier for me to say, well, who's available, and then to put together a cast of characters based upon that. But one character I really liked that I got to work with, and I have a lot of fun writing whenever I get a chance, is Forget Me Not. Because usually when he shows up, people just forgot he was there, because that's his mutant power, which is an incredible advantage if you are on like a secret assault team. He's not like super strong or really skilled at anything, but just the fact that people forget you're there gives you a huge advantage over the other side. Imagine if you were on a football team and you weren't necessarily a great athlete, but the other team didn't realize you were on the line, you were lining up. It's like you'd be unstoppable.
That is actually pretty cool. So is X Factor? I know X Factor crosses into X Manhunt here pretty soon. Are there any other plans for crossing over at any certain point, or is it kind of
sort of two crossovers? There's the crossover with Doom World in issue 7, and then there's a crossover with Manhunt in issue 8. But there's no other crossovers planned.
Okay, so it gets to stay in its own hermetically sealed little environment.
I mean, there is. It does refer back to the events of 7 and 8. The Doom World thing does sort of come up later. But yeah, those are the only two overt crossovers, which I liked doing the writing for the crossover, but I don't want to do too much of it, because it just feels like you're not telling the story you wanted. Your story's been kind of hijacked a little bit,
right?
So I like to keep those issues sort of few and far between.
I can appreciate that. I can only imagine that as a writer, how frustrating that might be to be told that your narrative needs to swerve in all these unplanned directions all of a sudden.
Yeah. And also, it affects your ending, so you have to leave it in the place it needs to be for the next story to begin. So it's like the two most critical parts of a story usually are the beginning and the end, and they're completely beyond your control.
Do you have anything that you're working on with DC at the moment, or soon?
Yes. I am working on a Wonder Woman series with Mike Allred, Mike and Laura.
The completing the trilogy of the Batman, Superman.
Exactly. It's
Age of Wonder.
Wonder Woman Golden Age. So it will be the third and most likely final part of the series.
Very cool.
"Quote unquote" age series.
Age series, right? If you ever have room for a fourth, Green Lantern Atomic Age is just sitting right there.
Yeah, I would love to. If they were say, this is just your thing, go ahead and do it. You can do as many of these you want. I would take them up on that. And yeah, I would do a Green Lantern one. I'd do one for the Flash. I'd probably do a Swamp Thing one.
Animal Man,
the Animal Age, the
Age of Pelts.
So, kind of talking about the Dark Age of Batman, how did when you were writing that, wrapping it up. How did that feel compared to finishing up the Superman one?
Yeah, well, the Superman one, when I finished that, I thought we weren't planning on doing a Batman one. So as far as I knew, this was it. And so it felt much more final to do the Superman one. Whereas it's like, I've written a book, I've written a novel now, and I'm very happy with it. And, and I'm glad I got this opportunity, and I was already starting to move on mentally to the next thing. But the Batman one was very different because not only was it written in conjunction with the Superman one, like dovetailing into it, but at that time I knew we'd probably do more. So it didn't feel as final. It felt more like, okay, well, how is this going to play? I was already thinking into the next thing. How is this going to play into one with Wonder Woman? So it felt more like I was writing a chapter than a book.
What's it been like partnering with industry legends like the Allreds?
Yeah, well, you can't complain. No, but Mike and Laura are not only, just like you say, industry legends. They become really good friends of mine. Like, they live in Eugene where I grew up, so I go down and see them all the time. I go down to their house for karaoke nights and like Halloween parties and stuff, and they're just the coolest people. And if you ever get the chance, if you ever get invited to the Allred compound, I would take it, because it's like a museum. It's like a museum to pop culture, and he's got so much cool stuff. A lot of which he built himself. A lot of which, he's very handy, and he made all these little dioramas and like life-size Boba Fett suits and stuff.
Wow,
but it's really cool. It's beside from being just super cool people, it's a whole experience just to go there and spend time with them. And they're excellent karaoke singers too.
Oh, well, there you go. Those are few and far between.
So do you have any convention plans for 2025?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I feel like more conventions this year than I did the last couple of years. I'm doing, aside from San Diego, I'm doing Emerald City in Seattle in March, and I'm going to Knoxville, Tennessee on Friday, for the what's it called? The Swing Into Comics convention. And then there's I'm doing one in Chicago, and doing the Fan Expo of Chicago in August, and one in Calgary, and one in Philadelphia. So yeah, I've got a bunch lined up.
Wow, no kidding. That's a busy schedule.
Yeah, I generally like to do about 5 or 6 a year, because I find any more than that, it's kind of hard to do the writing on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
But this year I'm probably doing about 10, because I've got 2 books I'm really trying to promote, the Grimm and Grimmer one, and then also the Traveling to Mars book.
So any, depending on how Grimm and Grimmer does, possibility of doing a second volume?
Yeah, I would definitely do a second volume. I mean, I would either do more Grimm fairy tales, or maybe something completely different, like, but with the same idea, like maybe the histories of Herodotus, or the Blue Fairy, or something like that.
Nice.
So, getting back to what we were originally talking about with Grimm and Grimmer, were there any specific tales that you wanted to include, but for one reason or another didn't, that could theoretically make a second volume?
Well, no, I think that the ones, the hits, the problem if I were to do a second volume is I feel like I've used most of the big hits that people know. And so I'd have to like probably dig a little deeper to find some more of those. But there's no shortage of ones, of the obscure ones I would do. I mean, I feel like I could do a whole book just of like ones people have never heard of before, or maybe don't know that well.
And then you get it, like you were saying, Herodotus, or something a little, maybe a little more esoteric or less well known.
Yeah, or yeah, just something like just a different storytelling tradition. One series that I'm trying to get off the ground, or that I've got percolating, would be a series just about historical queens. So a lot of them are from like medieval Europe, but also from the ancient Near East, or but like queens who sort of bucked the trend and became heads of state despite the fact they were women and had sort of really interesting, fascinating stories to tell.
That would be cool.
So hopefully I'll do that at some point. I would love to do more comics that are kind of nonfiction, like either based in history or biographical comics, or comics that are retelling existing stories.
Well, fortunately, there's no shortage of top shelf independent publishers right now that would probably leap at a chance to work with you on something like that.
I would hope. I don't know. Yeah. I have a good relationship with a lot of publishers, and I've been talking to some about some projects coming up. So hopefully, I'm hoping that that the as I evolve and as I find these new sorts of things that I find exciting and are different than what I've done before, hopefully they come along with me. Hopefully they don't always expect me to kind of write the same thing I've done before, because I don't think that's very interesting for anyone.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on the current state of the comic book industry as a whole? I mean, it's changing, things are happening, places are
Yeah.
declaring bankruptcy.
It's
Yeah.
scary. I'm not going to lie. It's scary and it's daunting, especially when you tack onto that, a trade war with China, which is where almost all comics are printed. That's not very good. It doesn't bode well for the industry. But at the same time, I'm not super pessimistic about it. I don't think the industry is going to die. I certainly don't think the art form is going to die, or the medium, but I think it will have to maybe make some changes. And I feel like what it's doing is pivoting more towards complete graphic novels, as opposed to individual floppy series. I think unless you're writing unless you're writing Amazing Spider-Man or Action Comics or something, if I had my own comics company, what I would probably do is I would just print issue number one as like sort of a loss leader. It's like, oh, issue number one, read this new series, and then no other issues until the book came out. Because I think the issue one would sort of serve both ends. It would be a good sort of like let people know whether or not they like this series.
Mhm.
It would also be kind of like a good sort of nod to the collectors market, which is very powerful in comics. It's like, here's an issue number one. But for a lot of people, it's like if they like a series, they're not going to buy every issue. If they're planning to buy the trade, for a lot of people, they'll stop buying the floppies. And so there's nothing harder than selling issue 4 or issue 5 of something. And a lot of that is just sort of wasted money and printing. So I would try to like find a way to like keep the excitement of having a new series and an issue number one without all the waste of like issues 5, 6, 7 that nobody's buying in the market, because either they've given up on the series because it wasn't for them, or they like the series, now they're waiting for the trade.
Interesting perspective. Chad, what do you think about that?
Yeah. I was just saying, as a creator in general, what's the best advice that you've ever received, and do you remember who gave it to you?
I think probably the best advice I ever got was really pretty early on. It was from Marie Javins, and she said, "Don't ever dare anyone to fire you," which I started taking to heart since, because it's like at the time you think, well, I'm this visionary and irreplaceable, which is not really true. It's like most people would rather work with somebody who is maybe 10% less visionary, but 90% less of a pain in the ass. So I try to not be a pain in the ass if I don't have to, if it's not absolutely necessary. And I think another piece of really good advice is to assume you'll have more good ideas. Don't be afraid to put all your good stuff on the page when it comes to you. Don't feel like, oh, I've got to save this for later. I've got this really great idea, but I got to save it for later because I don't want to use it on the series. just keep throwing whatever is your best work onto the page, and it trains you mentally to keep thinking of more ideas like that. It trains you mentally to keep refilling the toy box with good stuff. So I'd say those are probably the two best pieces of advice. Don't dare anyone to fire you, and don't be afraid to use the good china at every sitting.
I like it.
About conventions, any chance of New York Comic Con? Because I know we missed you last year.
Yeah, I would love to come back. It's just it's more expensive. It's hard to make it out there, and it's so close to like some other the conventions. Like it's close to Baltimore and stuff. So I might do it, but it's just sort of it's a bigger cost benefit analysis to come to New York than some of the other conventions. So maybe.
Okay.
Okay. Well, Mark, thank you so very much for your time this evening. I'm glad. I'm sorry we had to reschedule, but I'm glad you were able to make it work.
Well, thanks for having me as always. I always love talking to you.
Yeah, most definitely, man. If I counted correctly, this is your third time to be on the show. So
I think so. I think I'm 2 away from the green jacket.
You're getting there.
Yeah.
David Papose is actually right now slated to be the coveted number 5 interview with us.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah, yeah, he's coming up.
Send him my congratulations. Extend
March, early mid-March.
Yeah, and then we've got who do we have this coming Thursday in just 2 days, Chad?
Jamal Eigel.
Jamal.
Oh, perfect.
Awesome.
I like Jamal too.
Gotta love it, man. Well, the author and the creator is Mark Russell. The book is Grimm and Grimmer, and it's on sale now wherever finer books are sold. You should get out there and check it out because it's well worth your time. Mark, thank you. Thanks again. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming on. And for all of you listening, thank you for listening. It's as always our pleasure to get out there and talk about comics with the world, which can occasionally be a crappy place, but it doesn't have to be. Get out there, do something good for your neighbor, support local art, support local comics. Just do something good in the world because we really, really need it right now. Until next time, we're the Comic Watchers, and this is our show.